But wanted to talk a little bit with you all this evening. I do have a subject. And really the subject is urban spirituality. I should say probably beforehand that to say urban spirituality, it's not as if there's going to be described this evening some specific spirituality that only relates to the city. So, you know, we'll go through all of that. But just for me personally, you know, I'm a person who grew up in New York City. That's where I was born and raised, and then moved out here to Chicago, and was in Chicago for about 38 years or so, before coming out here to Wheaton, to the suburbs. And you know, quite honestly, you know, for someone growing up in these cities, the concept of the suburbs was something that eluded me in many ways. I didn't quite get it. You know, it's not really city, it's not really country, you know, it's like a platypus or something. What is it? But since getting out here, you know, I've been out here now for it'll almost be 2 years. I get it. I really get it. You know, my wife loves the city still, but I have no problems with not rushing back to see Chicago. Another thing that I have in my background, and I should tell you, just in college, just in my bachelor's degree study, you know, it's one of those things where you have to try to come up with a major. You know, what is it that your interests are? And as with many people, I can't say that I had a specific focus. I knew it wasn't going to be a doctor. I mean, all of my uncles had been doctors. So I knew that was out. That wasn't going to happen. Lawyer. So anyway, there was a field at the college that I was at, there was a major field called urban studies. I said, well, this is great. You know, I lived in a city. I probably will live in a city. This suits me. But anyway, then it ended up being quite interesting and quite involved, but that's way, way back. But what I want to talk with you about tonight is this. I'll start off with just paint a little picture for you. The year 2008, not that long ago, 4 years ago. 4 years ago, 2008, an event occurred that was unprecedented in human history on this planet. Now, to say exactly where it occurred is unsure, and the exact moment at which it occurred. But at some point during that year, what happened was this. Either a child was born in some city somewhere in the world, or some one person left the farm and found themselves entering into some city somewhere on the planet. And at that particular moment, for the very first time in human history, more than 50% of the inhabitants of this planet lived in cities, in urban areas. Unprecedented. Just to think about how fast this change occurred. You know, you go back in the United States, 1800. 5% of the people were living in cities, 95% farmers. You know, so you take 200 years, and there's this dramatic change. And what they're saying is, you know, unless this trend stops, which it won't, 2050, 75 to 80% of the world's population will be in cities. So, like them or not, it might be worth it to give some sort of consideration to the effects that city living and being a part of such a thing, and Wheaton would qualify as a city, much as it may seem otherwise. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. But it's something that deserves some level of consideration because it's affecting us as individuals, and it is affecting humanity and the planet in ways that are going to have to be addressed. I used to think, not too very long ago, a good deal of the message about the world's fragile ecology and the ever-increasing rate of pollution and the degradation of the ozone layer and overpopulation, all of those things we were being told were going to have dramatic effects at some future point. And as a parent, you find yourself thinking, gosh, my poor daughter, what she's going to have to face. And, that's a thought that you feel bad about what the kids are going to have to face. But then as things have moved on, it's become increasingly clear that most of us sitting here in the room are going to be around for all of this. I had kind of hoped I'd be dead and gone, really, because it sounded a little bit too serious and too dicey. But it looks like that's not going to happen. So given that sort of outlook, it's time to kind of start thinking about things. And particularly because this is a Theosophical society and because the real focus is on the more hidden and deeper aspects of our own being, what you might call the soul or the inner self or the higher self. How is it that that can come into play in ways that can be effective? So some of what we'll be looking at is that. But just to start it off, you begin by asking yourself, why is it that urban living has become so predominant as the global pattern? What is it about a city that has brought that into being? Because obviously, the people who are moving into cities, they're choices. You don't just have to move into a city, but they're moving there for some reason. For people who were born there, that's reason enough, but you can leave. Even when I was in Chicago, they didn't have moats and crocodiles to keep me in there. I managed to make it out at least to Wheaton. So what is it about a city that attracts these ever-growing populations? And I think if you look at it historically, way, way back, certainly the aspect of safety and protection was one of the main things that rooted people in an urban environment initially. Back when there would be like warring hordes coming through areas, to be able to have a walled-in enclosure where people could be protected was a very valuable thing. So, they sort of had their beginnings there, but then you start to find that when many people get together, other things start to happen. That it's not just about protection or safety in numbers. You start to find that such simple things as the way in which people trade goods together magnifies. It's the whole supermarket concept. No longer did people have to go to the ironsmith in another town to get the iron, to the person growing the corn to get the corn. It's all here. And so that's sort of magnification process. One of the other things you find with urban environments is that the exchange of ideas and culture and the influence that they have had on the arts and the thinkers and the innovation and the creativity that we witness in the world is also magnified. There's something about being in a place where you have, there are all these sort of unpredictable sorts of meetings that take place among people who don't even know each other that requires a certain inner creativity. And so that's one of the things that is one of the very strong points about urban environments. So now that we've talked about the strong points, let's talk about some of the other parts that are perhaps a little bit less strong. One of the features that I could tell it to you from the perspective of maybe the multiple sorts of scientific experiments that have been conducted. But probably you don't need a scientist's point of view to let you know that urban environments are overstimulating. That just to step into Chicago, to step into New York, or even in Wheaton, when you find yourself actually taking a look at the level of attention and mental energy that is required of any one of us just to get from home to here, we've gotten to the point we take it so much for granted that we don't even notice it. I mean, you're watching stoplights. You're constantly aware of the flow of the various people around you. You're watching to see if any of them behave in erratic manners. You're having to be aware of the cell phone ringing and not to answer it if you're driving. They're just constant sorts of stimulations that we're all continually exposed to. And, we tend to think that, okay, over time we have accustomed ourselves to it and it really doesn't affect us. It's not true. Experiment after experiment with people just like us has demonstrated the fact that cognitive processes are diminished in the face of ordinary sorts of city stimulus. There was a study that was done in Ann Arbor, Michigan, University of Michigan. There's a standard sort of test that they'll give to people where, they give you numbers, like 2, 5, 1, and ask you to say them backwards, 1, 5, 2. And, what they did was this. They took some students, gave them the test, and said, okay, now what we want you to do, half of you go take a walk. This half, go down the main city street. This half, we want you to take a walk in the park over there, and then come back. Brought them back, tested them again. The ones that went down the city street, scores dropped, plummeted. The ones that walked in the park area, their scores went up. Now, this is just scientific. Probably somebody funded that to the cost of many thousands of dollars to tell you something that you could have told me if I had just asked you. That city environments, overstimulation leads to mental fatigue. The problem is that along with that come other things that we associate with city living. Again, I'm just going to describe the city and then we're going to work our way out of there. But along with this sort of fatigue, which comes from constantly having to direct our attention at countless things that could threaten us or that we need to pay attention to, as that mental fatigue sets in, other things start to happen that have also been documented. For one thing, they find that aggressive behavior increases. Altruistic behavior decreases. And they do, brilliant people, they figure out these sorts of experiments. One of the ones that they do to show you about altruism going down, there's an experiment that they call the lost letter. And what they do is they'll have these addressed, stamped envelopes, and the researchers will just drop them off in different places. And the idea is to see who mails them. Obviously somebody dropped a letter. Who's going to take it upon themselves to do the right thing and put it in the mailbox or walk an extra block to the post office? And they do these tests where they put these letters around in city areas, and then they do the same thing, they put it in small towns. Now, if you had to guess, what would be the outcome in the city? Fewer people, way fewer people, are taking those letters and saying, I'm going to walk a block because somebody dropped it. Small towns, they come back. So, this is like this idea that, altruism, that's one of the tests that they do. But you can notice it yourself. You become a little bit deadened, desensitized to a lot of the things going on. Not too many years ago in New York City, maybe like 20 years ago, there was this standard practice. If you got on a subway train, each stop, all you had to do is you would just look down to the door going to the next car, because there's going to be another performer, basically, that comes in. And the performers that were coming in were, each one would step into the car and would say, in their loudest voice, "Excuse me." And then they'd tell you a tale of woe. And some of these tales were, it's the extremes of human experience. They'd have a guy coming in with his kid on his shoulder, "Oh, I have AIDS and I'm out in the streets with my son, and if you could just help me." And the son's up there and he's asleep because this is about the 25th car he's been in. And, you give something, and then the next stop comes, he goes to the next car, and the next door opens and the parade continues. And I was watching this, and at one point I said, now how far does this go? And I realized I had finally hit bottom when the car opens, the car door opens at one stop, and in walks this fellow, beyond down on his luck. Somebody who obviously has mental issues, but he walks in without a stitch of clothing on except a burlap bag. His feet are as crusty as can be. He has dread matted hair, and he can barely talk to say what it is he wants. And you find yourself looking at this, and it gets to the point where it's more of like watching a movie. And the whole sense of this sort of outflowing compassion that you might feel if this was someone close to you, or if this was the person in your town or village, it moves in different ways. And you find yourself being affected in those sorts of ways. And it's typical for city living. So, those are some of the things that affect us on outer level. So in terms of health, in terms of social effects, in terms of psychology. But obviously, our interest is really, rightly, what is it that's really going on at perhaps a deeper level? So, while all of these outer things are true, and while all these physiological responses are also true, there's something deeper that we need to kind of remember. Firstly, we tend to think of ourselves largely as this kind of physical unit. But really, probably we know it at some level, but in reality, we could describe ourselves more accurately as energetic beings. Energies are really what we're composed of, and they function at a variety of different levels. The body itself evolved over millions of years to adapt itself to a particular sort of environment that it found itself in. Well, in the last 200 years, that millions of years of evolution, the environment has shifted dramatically. No longer is it a thing where we're just exposed to a few foods and a few viruses. The world's viruses and the world's foods are what we have to learn to ingest. So the energetic component is something that we need to be aware of. And so what are some of those energies? What are some of those levels at which we function? And what is affected when we find ourselves actually in a city environment? So one of the things that's most clear, has anyone ever had the experience of sitting with someone, it could even be a friend, who could be described as maybe an angry person? And the feeling of being in the presence of that person. or having sat with someone who is deeply sad and you could describe as someone who is perhaps depressed. And when you sit in their presence, what is it that you feel? And I think to some degree, and we're all aware that perhaps when you're with someone who has like an angry edge, it's hard to become relaxed around them. Depressive, you find yourself sometimes feeling drained because it's sort of like a consumption of energy from you to them. So take that process and multiply it by 2 million for the city of Chicago, 34 million for the city of Tokyo. And you start to become aware that at any given moment, we're virtually swimming in a sea of other people's emotional energies, which actually have forms, thought forms and emotional forms, astral forms, are what we're continually encountering. And to the extent that we're unaware, they affect us. Even to the extent that we're aware, they have effects on us. So you end up having to try and think about, how do you approach that? There's this idea of, the term that's used is resonance. I mean, we're all familiar with it. You're most familiar with it if you take a tuning fork and you tap it. And if you tap a tuning fork in a certain key, and if there's a piano chord, a piano string that's tuned to that, you don't have to play the piano string, but it'll start to vibrate in response to the vibration of the tuning fork. It's a simple idea, and we've all seen it at work. But this is the exact same idea of the effect with each one of us, that we are resonant beings as well. And in the presence of someone who is resonating toward anger, it excites something in us. Toward happiness, it excites something in us. Toward peace, same sort of response. All of us have these seeds inside of us. Some people is more prominent than others. But you have these sorts of resonant responses that influence life on the planet, and particularly in city areas. I had something bring this home to me in a very direct way many, many years ago. This was back in a time when, I don't know if most of you were aware of a time when they had something they used to call blanket concerts. It was like a post-Woodstock thing, so this is historical here. So, basically it was one of those things where, you pay for your ticket and you go to the place, and they'd have multiple bands, but they didn't have to worry about seating because you're bringing your blanket. So I was at one of these, and it was a big one, and they had about 8 or 10 of the top bands that were going to be there. New York City, on this little island, I think it was Ward's Island in New York City. So one of the features about it for me was this. First of all, I shouldn't have even been there. Not because, I didn't like music, but because I had injured my knee and I was supposed to be having surgery. So for me to be there was probably, not the brightest thing to do, but the bands were going to be good. So I'm limping around. I'm limping around at this concert, and it's delayed for some reason. So it's starting later and later and later. And as it's starting later, people are starting to get a little bit restless. And I'm kind of walking around at the edge of the crowd, and I never will forget it. Because at one point, I was just walking around, and I was looking toward where the stage was, and there's a sea of people between me and the stage. And the way I saw it was that suddenly, every single person between me and that stage turned and started running right at me. I mean, it was a stampede, but my perception of the stampede was that it was all coming to me. So anyway, So here's what happens. You know, all these people are running, and to get there, they're sort of trampling who's ever in between them and their escape route. And so about 20 seconds later, I look around. I could barely walk, but I have outdistanced the entire crowd, headed away from that spot. And I sat, you know, as I caught my breath and as the adrenaline drained, you know, people kind of recovered. Nobody was really hurt. And so they still wanted to get their money's worth. They're going to stay for the concert. So I recovered, and the wise thing to do would have been to leave. Say, keep my $15 and I'm out of here. But it was very good for me because at that point I was, I guess, bigger on heart than I was on wisdom. I wasn't so long in the good sense category. So I said, I'm going to stay. But at that moment, you know, it's like in the cartoons. It was as if a light bulb went off. And I said, okay, the crowd's a little bit restless. I'll bet you this is going to happen again. And so I said, when it does, I'm going to try something. So I went back, and this time I kind of mingled in the crowd. And sure enough, it happened again. This time what I did was, as the people in front of me turned and started to run, I grabbed the two people that I could. And I looked at them and I said, what are you running for? And when I said that, they just stopped, and it's like, what am I running for? But when they stopped, the people behind them stopped, and so you could look at it, and there was this little fan that fanned out around this, me holding two holding four. And I said, man, you know, this happened. I said, man, this is good. I'll bet it'll happen again. And so I went to another, so about 2-3 more times it happened. And every time, but okay, this is this kind of resonant effect where one person responds from fear and sets a whole crowd in motion. I don't like to go into crowds to this day. I felt good about that experience, but I'm not 19 anymore. But the other thing that showed me was something that I've carried with me since, which is the idea that, you know, there were probably 10,000 people there. And that if you had 10 people in that crowd who were actually somehow aware and present in that moment, no stampede could have started in any part of the place. It would have been stopped immediately. But you didn't have 10. So what it let me know was that yes, in many ways there are problems. And yes, probably, particularly now, we find that a lot of them look almost insurmountable. But they're not. You know, I think it was Margaret Mead who made the statement that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and dedicated people can change the world. She said, in fact, it's the only way it ever has changed. And the truth of that. So what do we do? I mean, obviously, if you see all of these sorts of conditions that relate to the way that we live our lives now, you have to kind of start thinking about what you can do. There's this saying that, you know, I heard it so many times coming out of the mouth of Deepak Chopra and Oprah that I thought that one of them must have been the one that said it. But, you know, you've heard it too. I am not a human being having a spiritual experience. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. Actually, it was said by Teilhard de Chardin, who was a French priest and philosopher. But as an idea, it's very, very sound in the sense that it redirects our thinking toward something that's beyond just our emotions and our mind and our normal human experience, that there is, in fact, this sort of spiritual component that we would be told really almost overshadows this human being, when allowed to. The problem with that sort of approach to it is that the fact of the matter is that unless the human component is properly addressed, then the spiritual experience is denied. You know, if you're a person who is just filled with anger and upsets and irritations, and your mind is constantly in a state of anxiety and worry, there is no room inside of you for this deeper experience to occur. You filled it all up. So until we can actually learn to deal with the emotional and the mental aspect of it, then really the spiritual aspect is something that we can dream about, and a lot of people talk about it very, very well. But the experience is in somebody's book and in somebody else's life until we can actually do that very basic sort of work. And the Buddha, when he died, his last teaching, he sort of summarized everything that he had taught during 50 years of actually teaching. And he summarized it, he said a number of things, but he summarized it in 3 things, real short. You talk about pithy expressions. He did it. And the first thing that he said is, the 3 things were, first, do no harm. Second, do good. Third, purify your hearts or purify your minds. So when we take this sort of advice, which is sound, and try to apply it to how is it that we are going to direct our energies and our efforts in terms of trying to create an environment that is hospitable to spirit in these urban settings where crowding and the consequences of that affect us all. What do you do? And so it seems like the very first way our initial efforts are, you could almost describe them as being defensive. Self-defense or self-preservation, not in the Darwinian sense, and not in the sense of building a wall around ourselves either, but creating those environments that, first of all, minimize the turmoil in our minds, the roiling emotions. One of the easiest ways and the most direct ways, another one of these surveys that they did. From a scientific perspective, they don't necessarily know how to explain it, but they took Robert Taylor homes, which were the largest contiguous housing project development in the United States, in Chicago. And it was 3 miles of these brick buildings with, the poorest people living in it. And they said, we're going to do a study. And what they did was they took a couple of buildings. There were 150, 145 people involved in this study. And they wanted to study aggressive behavior inside of these homes. But what they did was very, very clever. So they said, we're only going to analyze people who are on the 2nd through the 4th floors. And we're going to divide these groups up according to what it is that they are looking at when they look out their window. So one group, when they looked out the window, they were seeing a brick wall and, pavement parking spaces. But on the other side of the building was some trees and some grass. They weren't looking at Sherwood Forest. It was just some trees and some grass. But then they analyzed it over a period of a couple of years to see the behaviors in these different housing units. And they found this undeniable, that the people who were facing a natural scenery, aggression, violence within their household, was greatly diminished in comparison with those who did not have that. All other ways, these households were the same. And it's, from a scientific perspective, sort of lends credence to common sense. One of the basic things in terms of like the to-do list in basic sort of self-generation and also self-protection is some way of associating ourselves with natural elements on a regular basis. I mean, now it's the norm. It wasn't always the case where people had houseplants in their home. But one of the things about nature, we had a woman who was the national president here years ago, Dora Kuntz. The source of her fame was that she was one of these extremely gifted clairvoyants who worked with the medical community largely. There's a wonderful book I'd recommend called The Personal Aura that she did, and it also has diagrams of the auras. In fact, she trained no less than our own Marilyn. But she would describe things, and she would always love to do things. She had her teaching seminars, and she would do these meditation practices, and she always wanted to do it in a natural element when possible. And the way that she described it was what it is that we get from nature. To begin with, in nature, there is no emotional conflict. It's absent of emotional conflict, of anxiety, of thought-producing sorts of patterns. It does not demand a directed attention of you. It has stable energetic patterns that unfold over time. So when we find ourselves in the presence of natural elements, even in our imaginations, it affects, it affects your heart rate, it affects your relaxation level. So find some sort of way to incorporate that into your surroundings. It's just a basic. So animals do the same thing, Cats, dogs. So these are just basic sorts of things. Another thing, for those of us who feel that the higher consciousness or the soul is an important component, it's a very useful practice to do a similar sort of thing in having, in your particular space, having little reminders, spiritual reminders, a little statue of a saint or a teacher or little sayings that you run, so that periodically, during the course of all of the busyness that we all are involved in, just through the very nature of moving your eyes around your space, there are continually these little reminders about a more stable sort of nature and of a deeper nature within us. Another thing that's largely overlooked, and these are like little simple how-to things. Probably if I were to go into any one of your homes, whether you have a small apartment or a large house, most of us have an area that we have for cooking our food. There's a kitchen. We have an area to entertain people when they come in. We have a bedroom that's dedicated to when we go to sleep. We have a bathroom that's dedicated to hygiene. But what some of us might identify as perhaps the highest activity that we can engage in, which is to say the act of quieting the self and allowing for the presence of this deeper inner self to make itself known, there's no space left. And I can remember being in college, when someone made this point to me. And there's no place where you cannot have a mat on the floor. They do that in prison cells, and they don't have a lot of space. That is a place that, when you go there, first of all of the time that has been, you bring to it this sort of dedicated inner attitude. So that when you sit there, even if your mind is in a flurry and even if you're filled with anxiety, there is a sort of calming influence that you have established there. In a lot of spiritual practices, they have all kinds of things to emphasize this, so that when you come into such a space, you take off your shoes. You don't track all of the stuff from everywhere else into these spaces. That if you have books that are about higher things, you don't put them on the floor, where other people have tread with all the sorts of energies that they bring in. All these sorts of things that probably putting the book on the floor doesn't affect its contents or its knowledge. But the act of regarding it as something that has a higher value affects you. So that sort of adjustment in the way that we approach things has a certain value. And probably I would say for the most beneficial thing for us would be taking the time to cultivate friendships and to create community. And, all friendships are not equal. Everyone adds certain benefits to us, but friendships with people who perhaps have some sort of similar perception that there is something deeper within them as within you. And those have, again, this quality of resonance, that to the extent that we find that in ourselves, we call it out in one another. And going forward, there's no doubt, this whole urban scene is going to continue. Cities are going to grow. They're going to sprawl all across the earth. And that's the fact. Sophocles said, "There is nothing great that comes into the world without a curse." This is what we have. And it has the potential for blessing. It certainly has its blighting sort of influence as well. But we're going to have to participate in this process of bringing it to some sort of new normal. The thing that we have going for us is this. In terms of the spiritual dimension or the deeper consciousness, the one that we would say, I really am, it requires no methods and no exercises. It doesn't need strengthening. What it requires is conditions that allow it to make its presence known. There's a story that was told about, well, it's not a story, it's just an idea that you have a gentleman who comes to tune a piano for a concert. And he can sit there for as long as he wants until he gets that piano tuned. But ultimately, you don't want the guy tuning the piano to be the one that gives the recital. That's not his role. And with you and me, this whole idea of the spiritual being having a human experience, our work is with this human component. Do no harm, do good, purify your hearts, purify your mind. That's the work that we find for ourselves. And to the extent that we can accomplish that, and to the extent that we can develop communities. I mean, this place was conceived of, Alcott Theosophical Society, was conceived of as such a community. And, you walk in here, and for 80 some odd years now. You have a spot that has been focused on no harm to other animals and life forms. You don't eat them, you don't kill them here. You have a spot where there's been a certain degree of meditation. You have a spot where there's been a focus on maintaining a natural element, and you feel it. And what are we, 30, 40 minutes from Chicago? I lived in Chicago. I lived in a neighborhood in Chicago that had bottomed out. And this is where this whole spiritual community group started. And, in the process of working with that, if you would have stepped into the yard that we had behind, you wouldn't know where you were. It was filled with flowers. It was, white stucco. We had beehives up on the roof. And this was, 5 minutes out of downtown Chicago, in an area where previously you really didn't want to park your car. But all of that changed. People started noticing, oh, there's something beautiful here. I think I'll buy that. And so before long, instead of the watching your cars, it was like the line of like the Mercedes and those sorts of cars that were there. So it is possible. And it's just up to us to kind of form these communities as we go along, to acknowledge and to invite the participation of the deepest aspects of our own being through practice, through cultivating those things that are impervious to negative emotion, peace, love, harmony, all those qualities. And so that's the goal that I would say is before us, and that's the role of our part in this urbanizing world. So that's about it. If you have any thoughts, if you have any questions, rebuttals, tell me that I told a lie, anything that you want.
If you do have questions, wait till I bring the microphone to you, please. Is there anyone who would like to begin?
I should say every time I talk, I deliberately tell at least 2 lies to find out who caught it.
Okay, I'll ask you.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just joking. I'm not going to ask you about lies.
Well,
Thank you
I
so
have 2,
much.
I should say.
Thank you so much. I'd like you to talk a little bit more. Maybe we can all talk a little bit more about your ideas and your experience. When you were talking about what I was saying, parting the Red Sea with all those people and the energies. If you think about nature and all the nature religions and the resurgence, say, for example, in Britain, which has many very strong urban areas, but the resurgence of nature religion there and the connection with the cycles and rhythms of the seasons and so forth. And same here, too, with people's fascination, even in the 19th century, I'm a 19th century historian, of urbanization. At the same time, you saw the raising up of a strong interest in Native American traditions back then, and we see it now. And being a Trekkie, I would say I was quite shocked to hear you predict that we would be urbanized, because in Trekkie land, it's just the opposite. Everybody leaves. We just work in the cities, and we live in the country, and everybody has transportation into the cities. So that being aside, I'm not quite sure. I think that the vision needs to be, the asphalt jungles, and having lived in New York City as a dancer and feeling the rhythms there and so forth, and also living in very rural areas like Eureka, California, where the earth is very unstable. And what's your vision about dealing with that spiritually and helping people as we grow community about that? What do you think?
There's somebody that said right now a lot of people would associate this particular moment as a sort of dangerous moment in many ways. It can go in a lot of different directions. But the idea that's expressed is that whenever you find yourself in the presence of what you sense to be danger, then necessarily it's because you're in the presence of power. And that's something that has to be addressed in this cycle of sort of like urban blight is one direction it can go in, or urban upliftment. And you see that happening right now. Many people are developing a vision for city living, which softens it in many ways. even in the city of Chicago, nowadays it's not uncommon to find people having gardens and green roofs and green space in those areas, trying to minimize, because the city actually does make for more efficient transportation because it's shorter distances to go, but they're using inefficient means. So there are people who have this sort of vision of a green city and of a city that has communities of people that are served not only through the arts, but in terms of like the spiritual dimension as well. And those sorts of possibilities exist. There's an institute called the Santa Fe Institute, which are doing sort of dramatic work in terms of revisioning urban living. And so we're just sort of at the cusp of a lot of these possibilities. But it can work. I mean, as I know, I lived in a city, and it's a small model, but gardens, beehives, relationships with neighbors on all sides, all of that was there. So I don't know if that speaks directly, but.
I don't think I really understand the psychological reason that people want to move to the cities. Because certainly as I age, I'm going in the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. And I guess in a way, there are more resources in the city, mm-hmm. and possibility of more connections. Mm-hmm. But, when you're predicting in 2050, that perhaps 75 to 80% of the world will be truly urbanized, that's really shocking to me.
Well, it's shocking to me as well, but when you start to look at the migration that's taking place, it's just the fact. And unless there is something that stems that.
But then psychologically, what's the triggering element? What's causing that?
Well, I can tell you, I have a friend who came to the U.S. from Colombia, and he tells the joke, but he tells about how somebody came here from Colombia and they arrived at the airport in New York. And they get off the plane, it had been a long flight, and he was tired. So said he's walking with his friend who picked him up, and as he walks, there's a $100 bill laying on the floor. And he looks at it, and his friend says, well, aren't you going to pick it up? He says, no, I'm tired, I'll start picking them up tomorrow. And it's a joke, but it's an expression of the idea. Why are people coming to the cities? Because there is the sense that there is a better life that awaits them. And because the sort of grinding poverty that is the experience of many people in rural areas, it's like, do I take the pot or do I take the fire? But at least as long as there's these visions that things can be better in the city. And, strictly from a dollars and cents perspective, perhaps it is. Many people come and are able to send money to their relatives. But then the lifestyle that they have to live is the cost. Because the way cities are arranged right now, it doesn't, they're not made to accommodate much more beyond trade. So that's the pattern. That's the pattern. People are leaving the farm, and there are cities being built as we speak. Let me tell you, I went to Tibet about 3-4 years ago. And to get there, we had to fly through China. And we flew to, well, let me ask you this. Do any of you know the city of Chengdu? You know about Chengdu. Anybody else? Okay, so we got about 2-3 people. I had heard of Chengdu only because shortly before I got there, they had a major earthquake. Chengdu is a city of 10 million people. Larger than New York. You never heard of it. And is one of 40 cities over 1 million people in China, and growing. India, same sort of thing. I mean, you got like 1,000 cities in the world now that are over 1 million people. So it's one of those things where it's not so much on the awareness of the average American, because our process, we're already at 75%. We think it's amazing for the world, but that's where we are and have been. So, what's happening now is that the remainder of the world, the same sort of pattern is in effect. Only we've kind of exhausted it by the time they get there. So a new pattern is what we're going to have to...
I can comment on what you were saying. I read an article in the National Geographic about the declining population in Brazil, and it's totally voluntary. Anybody else read that article? They narrowed it down. This might speak to values. You said, why are people leaving the suburban and country and going to the city? Well, in Brazil, they blame it on electricity. Why electricity? Because electricity was brought out to all of the villages where their people are having 15 kids per family to help with the chores, the farming chores. They got electricity, they got televisions and internet. They started getting hooked on soap operas, Brazilian soap operas, which show the lifestyle of big city living.
Yep.
They want to live in the discotheques. They want the fancy clothes and the hairstyles, and that's what they want. That's the value that they don't want what their parents had. They see them working with the fields and all of that. So what caused that to happen? I don't know. Is it part of human nature? I don't know.
a lot of it's... all of this stuff is really hooked to values when you come right down to it. And, certain values have been promoted, but in part, for some of these things to shift, there's going to have to also be a shift in certain basic kind of values so that the valuation for, objects is strong. But, in a way, a lot of the valuation that we place on these things is not for the object itself. It's not for the discotheque, it's not for the, the bling, it's for the sense of at least momentary happiness that they can bring. And the problem with those sorts of things is that they do in fact work. When you get something that you like, for a moment, you feel good. Of course, it does not last. So there's something deeper, and if we can focus on what that deeper something is, that, you look at the spiritual traditions of the world, and, what they would tell you is that the deepest sorts of fulfillment comes when we recognize, the way some might put it, is who we are. Beneath the body, beneath the emotions, beneath the thoughts that we think, there is something else. And when that something makes its presence known in our world, we find ourselves feeling quite happy, feeling quite joyful, and trying to figure out how to repeat this incident. And it's repeatable, but it never occurs in quite the same way. And so, the emphasis on meditation, on prayer, is because we do find that these are successful methods for having this experience of a deeper sort of joy and fulfillment. And so to the extent that that starts to become the value, that's something that is really, it's independent of gross national product. It can occur at any moment, and although it's not completely something that is at our beck and call and under our will, the practices that lead to it are very clear. And to the extent that we can engage in those regularly, then we start to find that is Bhutan, where they have the gross national happiness is the measurement. And so, you start to find that if gross national happiness is what you're looking to expand, it doesn't come through consumption. So making that shift begins with you, and it begins with me.
I have thought about the difference between living in the city and living in the country. And one of the things that I have been amazed at is the fact that great spiritual leaders have not come out of cities as far as I'm aware. They've all been country people they were isolated for 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, or something like that, where they were totally by themselves, had no distractions, had to survive, but they were growing spiritually without the interference of the city around them. Can you think of any great spiritual leaders that have come out of our cities?
Well, beside Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad, I would have to start looking. But that's a good beginning. I mean, Buddha was born in a city. He left it, of course. Jesus, he spent his time they all would retreat to the wilderness. And to some degree, that's factual. And to some degree, that's allegorical as well. So, often it's hard to kind of say which is which. But you've had, some of the great spiritual teachers that have grown up and had their roots in cities. But then often they experience, as you say, their growth when they go off into solitude. But then they come back again. I mean, Buddha taught in cities, he taught in forests. Jesus taught by the seaside, he taught in town. Muhammad, the same sort of thing. So the kind of, I think what the city does for us, and I think one of the great spiritual advantages in a way, perhaps it's good to look at it this way because in a way city is what we've got, is that the people who are developing a spiritual practice in urban settings are challenged. And to the extent that we're able to bring it off, you really become very solid in ways that perhaps you wouldn't be able to experience just sitting off in the woods by yourself. Because every moment you're challenged by the guy that cut you off. By all of the different things that we encounter every moment. So you get a very, very solid sort of practice. And it seems as if, for the particular time that we're in, and given the choices that we have, not too many of us are going to be living out in the forest or in the cave. So it would be well at least to think that this might convince ourselves that these challenges are things that are going to be good for us. And I think they are.
You reflected earlier about how cities are built to be efficient for transportation and not a lot else. Mm-hmm. How do you think cities could be built to be more spiritually healthy?
Mm-hmm. Well, for one thing, one of the emphasis in Buddhism particularly, there's the idea of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So you have the teacher, the teaching, and then the body of individuals who are trying to realize what that teaching contains. So what you find is that when you have these sorts of groups of individuals, that they have there's a power that they exert. And part of it comes from this idea of resonance, far beyond their numbers. And so it has sort of a softening and spiritualizing influence in whatever area you find those people. And I think this is something that is already going on in cities, where you have groups of people who have realized that the real way to the future is not in the isolated practitioner, but in the community, the Sangha concept. And so people are finding each other. There really is something of a global network that's taking place right now among all these various little small spiritual groups and small spiritual practitioners, where you find them coming together in ways that the internet has helped that. And I think that's something that's going to be a very positive force going forward. I also think that one of the positive forces, unfortunately, is that we as individuals and as a human family tend to respond to crisis. And to a certain extent, you precipitate crisis. And then you respond. I didn't know this, but I heard that Pearl Harbor, so when the bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor, it took all of 3 days for this entire nation to mobilize in terms of rationing of food, rationing of gasoline, in order to address this crisis that had suddenly arisen. 3 days. It's remarkable to me. 100 million people. But that sort of thing tends to galvanize. You don't want it to have to be something like that, but I see that it can be something of a mixture of the two. The periodic crisis stimulates a certain sort of growth. And also, I do believe, now this is a general sort of speaking, that in keeping with this idea that there is this sort of network that is forming of like-minded people, of spiritually oriented people in this world, that's something that's largely unseen. I mean, it doesn't make it onto the news. But that's something that is growing, and I'm sure is going to start to exert a much greater influence as things move on. So this is my hope. I would call it my vision, but until I see it, maybe I better just call it a hope. Yeah. Lauren? You didn't ask anything, but just in case.
Did you have a question?
Now,
she's studying this sort of stuff, so I want her to
we
enlighten
know
all of you.
that this global movement is happening, but really we know people here obviously have been drawn to these higher energies, but how do we really make that on such a global level where people who may not be ready for it actually see this awareness? Because everywhere we look, we see disunity, we see discordance. How do we realize that not so much we make people, but how do those people become self-aware? Not just starting from us, but just like really spreading out.
I think a lot of that's not in our hands. I mean, people wake up when they do, but often you see it's very easy. The disunity is what's portrayed most widely. And then often it makes you have to work a little bit harder to see signs of its opposite, where there is actually a sort of unity going on. I mean, now we just celebrated the anniversary. It's not a celebration, but we memorialized the anniversary of 9/11, just day before yesterday. And I can remember, of course, I can remember the day as anybody can. And what I remember as immediately flowing out of that, which now is forgotten largely, was that there was a global outpouring of compassion, of a sense of unity that was utterly remarkable. And it was global. Any city you went into in the world, there were shrines and there were flowers and there were vigils and prayers being said because of this terrible incident that had linked the globe. And of course, that was momentary. But it points to a possibility. And it points to, I think, a hidden fact about us all, that in spite of the sense of disunity that tends to be most commonly portrayed, that our essential nature is compassionate, is loving. That within humanity as a whole, there's a recognition that there is one thing going on, and it's us. And so I think that what you have is you'll have moments of recognition, and just like that particular moment, it fades. But basically, it's pulling the veil back from something that's hidden most of the time. And when you're reminded, then many people choose to go in that particular direction. And then it disappears momentarily. So I think that's sort of the process that goes on. Sure.
Last question.
You have the last word, Martha.
No, you're going to have the last word.
Maybe.
I think for me, the elephant in the room is the national attention to the violence in Chicago. And we sit here, and you've talked about your passion and your love for that city. So what is the role, or is there a role for the Theosophical Society in America, and your insight into the role that this organization will play in terms of bringing solutions to that?
I mean, again, we're not going to have a platform and a particular program for the people, because really it's something that all of this, in a sense, boils down to the quality of the consciousness that each one of us is able to exhibit or connect to. And so the Theosophical Society now, as in the past, is an organization that's sort of that is focused on presenting methods for people to accomplish that, and helping those who are in the process of trying to further that. So I think that'll be our contribution. I mean, when I was in Chicago, the contribution was, again, we were working with people in an area that, where meditation wasn't on everybody's lips. Theosophy was not on everybody's lips. At that time, it was actually some of these same people who would be out there shooting. That changed. But what you found, and what I found, very often a lot of the sort of misleading sorts of news reports, at that time the big deal going on was gang activity. So you had these groups of young men, mainly, in these gangs. And they were running around shooting each other. But one of the things that you found, actually, was that within those particular groups, some of these very misguided people were just natural-born leaders. Just natural-born. I mean, you'd have like 15-year-olds leading 200 and 300 and 400 people to do wrong, but leaders. And, when they found other options, a number of them became leaders in that particular direction. And so I've seen that possibility for the only thing that the only thing that continues darkness is the absence of light. And that in the presence of light doesn't have to sweep darkness away. It doesn't have to turn on a vacuum cleaner and vacuum it up. Just the presence of that dispels darkness. So to the extent that you can have one lighted individual, it necessarily has an effect. And so the role of the Theosophical Society now as before is, what do we do to try and help to turn on that light?
I think there is one lighted individual right at the back who would like to ask a question.
Thank you.
You better be lighted.
I really don't want you to end up the night in a sad note, but keeping the thread of Martha's thought about violence, I remember reading years ago a book written by C.W. Leadbeater in the early 1900s, I believe. It's entitled Vegetarianism and Occultism. And in this particular book, it's a very thin book. He describes, I think it was the first visit of Dr. Annie Besant, one of the second international president of the Theosophical Society internationally. She visited the city of Chicago for the first time, and she was a very sensitive woman, a clairvoyant as well. She perceived this terrible, horrifying aura of the city that had to do with the slaughterhouses that were here in the city of Chicago. So I don't know what you have to comment on that. If you living in the city of Chicago had experienced some of this violence related to this subtle thing of the non-vegetarian communities, and how can vegetarianism affect or bring some goodness to communities like that? Because it says actually some of the is one of the teachings that the Theosophical Society bring forth, this principle of ahimsa, as well as Buddhism, but it's very ingrained in our culture. So if you can comment on that.
Ahimsa being harmlessness, the whole idea of do no harm. Actually, I lived in Chicago. Before they completely got rid of these stockyards, I've forgotten exactly what year that was, but I was probably, maybe 3-4 miles distance from where they were. And I can tell you that on a given day, if the wind switched, it just blanketed whole communities with the stench. And back in Annie Besant's time, of course, it was worse. But obviously that's another one of those things. They had all those sociological studies and people living in those areas. There was just high crime, low education. So obviously those things have an effect. I think the overall idea, though, I don't think that necessarily people's diets necessarily turn them toward a direction of harmlessness. I know some very abusive vegetarians. People who eat nothing but Boca burgers and can be abusive in their behavior. So it's not specifically diet, although diet, you do everything that you can to help. I think diet can help. But I think a lot of what it is, what is it in the Bible they talk about, it's not what goes into your mouth, but what comes out that is the measure. So to the extent that we can cultivate those deeper qualities, which are really the qualities of the spiritual intuition, when we talk about compassion, love, peace, harmony, generosity, patience, the Fortune 500 of virtues, those are things that are characteristic of this sort of spiritual inner person that we really are. So when we can cultivate the environment that invites that to come out and play, you could say, that's the real work. If diet helps you to do it, fine. But the Dalai Lama is a meat eater. Every Tibetan, I've known one high Tibetan Lama, and I've known a lot of them, who was vegetarian. And some of the nicest, kindest, most compassionate people. So it's not about diet specifically, which is not to say, every single study in the world says if you want to do something that's going to impact global warming and the rates of pollution of the atmosphere in the most immediate way, the most immediate thing would be to change your diet to vegetarian, because it involves less fuel used to truck meats, it involves less crops grown to feed animals, it involves less deforestation to graze the animals. So, it's a fact that what we eat is linked to the surroundings that we see. But I say that's something that every person has to kind of think through for themselves.